Okay.
Tell me when it starts.
Go.
Go.
Okay. All right. So passive range of motion for long flexors, long extensors, and intrinsics is very similar to the special testing for those three types of tightness. So if you're testing for long extensor tightness, so your long extensors come all the way up here. They cross all of the finger joints, the wrist joint. So as you bend all of those joints, you put the long extensors on more and more of a stretch. So when I bend just the wrist, I'm mainly stretching the wrist. But if I wanted to test for long extensor tightness, I would bend the wrist forward and then I would start to bring the fingers in. So he doesn't have any long extensor tightness. But if you did, you would bring the fingers in and then you would experience some tightness. And somebody who has long extensor tightness, when the wrist is back in extension and you bring the fingers into flexion, they can easily come into flexion because you haven't fully tensioned the long flexors because you took a little slack off from the wrist. So that's testing it. Stretching for long extensor tightness is just the same position as you would try to test it in. So if I was stretching somebody for long extensor tightness, I would bring their wrist into flexion and then gradually bring their fingers into more and more flexion and hold them in a position where they felt a gentle, tolerable stretch for like maybe a minute or so for a low load prolonged stretch. Now, if I'm testing long flexor tightness, so your flexors go from your proximal forearm volarly up to the tips of the fingers on this volar surface. So this is where the flexors are. So when you bring the wrist and the fingers into combined extension, you stretch the long flexors. So if I was stretching back like this, where I'm just letting the fingers relax, then I'm mainly stretching the wrist. But then as soon as I bring the fingers in where all of the joints are brought into an extended position, I'm stretching that long flexor by bringing those joints into composite extension. Composite means all of the joints. If I wanted to stretch long flexor tightness, it would be the same exact way. So I'd bring the wrist back and the fingers back, and then I would hold it in that position if I was doing passive range of motion for perhaps a minute. Intrinsic tightness is tested by comparing how much PIP flexion you have with the MP bent. So if with the MP bent, the patient has more PIP flexion, and then when you come into extension or hyperextension of the MP joint, they have less, then that indicates long extensor tightness. That indicates intrinsic tightness. So this is testing intrinsic tightness. I'm a little tired right now, so I messed that up a little bit. So the intrinsic muscle does this, right? So the way you test if that is tight is you bring the MP joint into extension, which is the opposite of what the intrinsics do. So you bring it into extension, and then you do the other opposite thing that the intrinsics do. You bend the PIP. So to test for intrinsic tightness, you compare MP flexion with PIP flexion, which would be more, but then MP extension with PIP flexion would be less if the person has intrinsic tightness. So if you're stretching for intrinsic tightness, it's nearly the same, but you can bring the DIP joint in. So you bring their MP joint into extension and their IP's in flexion, and you hold it there for maybe a minute or so. So that's testing for intrinsic long flexor, long extensor tightness, and passive range of motion for intrinsic long flexor and long extensor tightness.